Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. After a couple of weeks off, we are back and refreshed from a holiday. And I'm very excited because we have an excellent book and a wonderful author here to join us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. I'm Louise Fein. I'm the author of The Hidden Child, which is just out in the States and Canada. And I write historical fiction, usually with a slight twist and with themes that tend to resonate a little bit with today as well.
I'm so glad that you brought up the themes that resonate with today, because one of the things I mentioned to you when we were chatting beforehand is that this feels like very different subject matter than we've seen, especially recently with the trends in historical fiction. And I think it's such a wonderful book because it's such a fascinating subject. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what people might find when they pick up The Hidden Child.
Sure. So The Hidden Child is set primarily in 1920s England. It's the story of an up-and-coming couple called Eleanor and Edward, who are very wealthy. They have everything going for them. Edward is a big name in psychology and education, and he is also
My apologies.
That's okay. He's also a very ardent eugenicist. Eugenics was a very popular movement at the time. For people who don't necessarily know what it is, it was a concept that came out of Darwinism about survival of the fittest. And the idea was that you could breed out of the human population certain inherited conditions, which they considered detrimental to society. So, for instance, conditions like epilepsy, which features in the book, but also wide-ranging things like alcoholism, criminality. And it was a widely accepted concept at the time, which actually then was adopted enthusiastically by the Nazis. I feel that we brush it under the carpet rather a lot in this country and in America. But basically, this couple are having a wonderful life until their own 4-year-old daughter begins to suffer from seizures. And it's really what happens from there, the pressure that puts on the couple and their relationship, and then various secrets start to come out about Edward's own past. So yeah, that's a very brief synopsis of the story.
They really do seem like the perfect couple and the perfect marriage on the outside when you first meet Eleanor and Edward. Can you tell us a little bit more about them and about both the work that he's done and also the life that she's created at? Is it Brookend, their home?
Yeah, so Brookend is their country home. They also have an apartment in London. Edward is a very hardworking man. He was a war hero, a decorated war hero bearing in mind the First World War was only 10 years ago. And the country really is undergoing a massive amount of change at this time. And this couple sort of gets swept up in that. Edward has secrets from his past. I'm trying not to give too much away.
It's a very tricky one because you do really weave these things together in such a way, but we'll try to stay on the right side of spoilers.
And I mean, he's a flawed person who, you know, at the time, a man was very much expected to be a masculine, you know, not to get upset by things, not to, you know, just to be tough and to carry on. And he's trying to live this life where actually he's been quite badly affected by what happened to him in the First World War and before. And Eleanor, she started life actually in quite a wealthy, well-to-do family, but like many families at that time, they were very badly affected by the First World War. So her father was damaged and died as a result, and her 2 brothers were killed. And then unfortunately, her own mother was murdered by a person who they considered to be one of the unwanteds in society, and that's why she really supported the eugenics concept as well. But she's living this happy life, sort of at Brookend, sheltered from what was going on in the rest of the world. And she and her younger sister Rose, who lives with her and Edward, they're very different personalities, and that creates quite an interesting topic as well, about the concept of women getting a voice at this time, of women having careers. And actually in the 1920s, women had an unprecedented amount of freedom, and that creates tension in society and in homes.
I would love to talk a little bit about the dynamics between the sisters in a moment here, but I think the dynamic between Eleanor and Edward is really interesting, and how, again, without talking too much, spoiling too much about this book, but sort of really how I think, his almost parental guidance of her throughout their marriage starts to really change. I get the sense that this is a time period where there's a huge amount of change underway. The First World War has happened, as you said, but we haven't had the stock market crash yet. What is it you were hoping to do with setting this book in this particular time period? It feels very intentional that it would be set in, is it 1928, 1929?
Yeah, 1928, 1929. It was intentional because this was a time of really big change. And I love setting my books at times of change, because it feeds into a great amount of tension. And Eleanor had slightly unusual background in that she had to work for a living, but actually a lot of women did have to work for a living when their fortunes went down after the First World War. Society in England was completely changed from before to after the First World War, and women had the vote. They were, a few of them were members of Parliament. They were beginning to really have careers. And so Eleanor is caught up in it to an extent, but at the same time, women were very deferential to their husbands, and their husbands expected them to be deferential. So she probably undergoes the biggest change of all the characters in the book, because she starts to take control of her life. And up until the point where she does that, she's very typical of a wife and mother at that time, in deferring everything to her husband.
It's so interesting meeting her sister on the page also. Rose is, I think, what many modern women would sort of identify a little bit more strongly with, in terms of, she's a woman who's full of ideas and full of passion and vigor, but she's also gone out and she wants to work and she wants to live her life in maybe a different way than her sister has. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between those two characters?
Yeah, well, they're very close as sisters because they had been left all alone in the world. And Eleanor is actually quite a few years older than her sister. So when we first meet her, Eleanor is 27 and Rose is 19. And Eleanor is sort of half mother, half sister to her, because she'd sort of raised her in the latter years, and Eleanor and Edward together almost parent her. And then Rose begins to stretch her wings. She's quite a different personality to Eleanor. She's quite feisty, and she has very firm ideas about what she wants out of life. And Eleanor is she's quite protective, so she's trying to rein her in all the time. And sometimes she's quite shocked by her sister, I think, being that bit younger, at a time when younger women probably had more advantages in some ways than the older generation of women, so that it probably would have been quite shocking, some of the things they did. On the one hand, Eleanor's trying to rein her in, and on the other hand, she's quite admiring of her sister's sort of forthright nature. They do have a close relationship, and they sort of feed off one another, I suppose. And in some ways, they become Eleanor sort of learns from her sister, which I think as the older one, she didn't expect to do.
And then, of course, there is the third, maybe not woman, but girl, really at the heart of the story, Mabel as well, who is 4 years old, I believe, when we meet her.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about Mabel's role in this story, and also where we meet Mabel in terms of medicine and science? Because I think that is really going to be something that people really sympathize with and maybe don't know that much about.
Sure. Yeah, so Mabel is absolutely central to the story. She's central, but she's missing from a fair part of it. And that's because being a child with a condition which was very shameful in the 1920s, the idea was really to hide her away from the world. And so we see what's happening to Mabel actually partly through the voice of the condition that she has. So I might be jumping ahead of your questions here.
Oh,
but,
go ahead. This is something I'm curious about.
We have an extra character in the book, which is actually the character of epilepsy. And through epilepsy, we see what's happening to Mabel. She is obviously, she's only 4. So what happens to her is totally outside her control. At the time, there were some quite experimental forms of medication, some of which were quite horrific, really, in their side effects. And some of the modern medicines that we use for epilepsy even today have some awful side effects. And I know that because my own daughter suffered from epilepsy from a very young age. So this is partly taken from my own experience of the condition. But at the same time, a very useful treatment began to be used in the 1920s. And I only learned of that treatment through our own experience. So that's really where that came from. But of course, Mabel is the center, but she's entirely powerless. And I think that comes across, hopefully, in the novel.
No, absolutely. And you get the sense that she's a lovely young child, and there is a lot of societal shame, as you say, that's piled upon her because of that. And her family feels a lot of shame as well. And I have to say, I was particularly moved and touched by this book because in my extended family, we have had an experience of this. It would have been sort of the late 30s, early 40s, where a family member was diagnosed and was very much kept away from society because of whatever reason. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about those reasons and about some of the lack of understanding and the stigmatization that was going on at this time. And then, as you say, this is also a book about what's going on today as well.
Yeah. So the concept at the time, which was really propagated by the eugenics movement, was that epilepsy was an inherited condition, and that it was caused by bad gene plasma or some weird thing, and that epilepsy was also connected to criminality, to sort of sexual mischievance, to overeating, to all kinds of really bizarre ideas that were not looked upon kindly,
Yes.
and actually were totally false. And so the idea was that epileptics should be kept in institutions. And I'd never really heard of epilepsy colonies before I started researching for this book, but there were a lot of epilepsy colonies, both in the UK and in the US, where people were kept for the whole of their lives. From a very young age, they never came out. Some of them were, I think the idea behind them was that they would have a place to live without stigma and to be safe and to be amongst their own kind. But actually what happened was not as good as the idea behind them, if that makes sense, as with a lot of things that we humans tend to do. And they weren't allowed to get married. They weren't allowed to have relationships because they didn't want the bad genes to be passed down. And that stigma behind epilepsy has continued till today. Obviously not in the same way, but there is still a lot of stigma around the condition, for sure.
And I think this leads on to one of, I think, the absolutely fascinating points of this book, which is the eugenics movement. And I have to admit, I feel it's almost an uncomfortable thing to talk about, regardless, because it to me as a modern person, it seems like such an obviously horrible idea and such an easy way to stigmatize people and to enforce incredibly racist and classist ideas onto people, legislation, everything. But there was real weight behind this movement, wasn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you can name so many famous people who were massive eugenicists. A lot of the ideas behind the birth control movement came from eugenics, the concept that actually poorer people were breeding at a faster rate than the better off people. And so if they were to practice birth control, it would lead to a better class of society. It is uncomfortable saying these things.
It is, yes.
It's quite awful. And in the UK, the ideas were quite class-based, whereas in the US and then in Germany, it was more racially motivated. But the same ideas really were circulating in both countries. And yeah, it's horribly uncomfortable, but I think there are still remnants of that movement, even today, where, one person's idea of a disability which should be bred out of the population if it has a genetic link is another person's idea of difference. And yeah, where do you draw the line? And we know that as human beings, what starts off as actually what sounds like a good idea can be totally manipulated and lead to something much worse than anyone ever envisaged at the time. I'm sure Darwin never thought his ideas would lead eventually to Nazi Germany. So, yeah.
I think it's also interesting because one of the things that your book does really beautifully is show that maybe somebody's personal philosophy for the world and how society should work really starts to change or really is challenged when it becomes something that affects them immediately as an individual or somebody that they love.
Yes, absolutely. It's very easy, isn't it, to be general, to think about things in the big sense when it doesn't involve you emotionally, but when it affects your own family or someone you begin to think about things really differently. I mean, to an extent, that's the case with all of us. I really didn't know that much about epilepsy until my own child had it. So, of course, we all become more sympathetic, I suppose, when we know more about something. But I think that whole experience changed me because I understood, about all kinds of other similar conditions or things that affect people. And I suppose I was just trying to start a conversation about these things, where if it doesn't affect you, you don't have to think about it. Mm-hmm. But maybe we all should, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I'm really curious about the research process for this, because as you've said, you, depending on your own experience with these things, maybe have more or less knowledge going into a topic like this. How did you start the research process, and what was the inspiration behind, first things first, what was the inspiration behind this book?
Okay.
I won't step on myself here.
So I had two real points of inspiration. One was obviously my own daughter, and I suppose that had always been something I wanted to write about at some point, but until it was too raw until she actually is now a teenager and she's quite healthy and everything is going well for her. I mean, she's not completely perfect, but you know, what is perfect? And
Yeah,
I couldn't write about it until we were in a good place, if that makes sense.
absolutely.
And the second part was when I was researching for my debut novel, People Like Us, Daughter of the Reich in the US, I was quite surprised to find that, you know, the basis for eugenics, which was utilized in Nazi Germany, came from the UK and America, and just how widespread it was, and how, you know, a lot of the early research for Nazi Germany was funded by people like Rockefeller and some of the wealthy Americans, and how even their 1935 law was based on a law in California, almost word for word. So I was quite surprised about all of that, which I hadn't known. And so those two combined ideas, really the story grew out of that. In terms of the research, I was very lucky that I managed to get this research done before lockdown, because I was able to go and look at archives of asylums and a former epilepsy colony, which is in the south of England. They opened their archives for me, which was amazing. And I was able to go there, and it's 200 acres, which it was a colony and is now actually a school for children with epilepsy. But you got a real feel for how it must have been. And I have to say, looking at those archives was quite grueling. The way that the staff talked about the people, how there was really no love, you know, at worst it was matter of fact. It was, you know, certain cases stick out in my mind. There was one little 5-year-old girl who was taken to an epilepsy colony, and her mother told her she would pick her up the next day, and she was still there 70 years later. They were never visited by their families. It was quite an upsetting process. And I felt like these people needed an airing, you know, their stories needed to come out into the open. So I suppose that's where that idea came from.
Well, perhaps this is a good time to mention that Wanda, who's watching, has left a comment saying, as a mother of a 24-year-old son who has suffered from epilepsy since his first birthday, I can't thank you enough for bringing this out in the open. It's usually never discussed. So it's obviously resonating with people.
Thank you, Wanda. And yes, I hope it does bring it out into the open. And I know it's a historical fiction, but I always try to make things resonate with today.
We have a question here also saying, this is such a fascinating topic, but heavy topic. Do you ever feel you need to take a break from reading about eugenics? Did you do anything in particular to get through?
It was a funny time because I did the research and then we kind of went straight into lockdown. So it was actually a really, really intense time with homeschooling and pandemic. So, you know, it's all a bit of a blur. I think I wrote to escape, but obviously I was escaping into a bit of an unpleasant world. It's not all heavy. I mean, obviously
Sure.
it's a heavy topic, but there are some light moments in the book, and it does end on a positive note. So, I mean, I enjoyed writing about Rose and the relationship between the two sisters. And in terms of relaxation, I mean, I walk the dog, watch movies and that sort of thing. But and the book. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I was going to talk about the book I'm writing now is completely different. So yeah.
No worries. Well, we'll definitely make sure and ask about that. But I'm glad you mentioned that there are other moments in this book, and of course, there's a whole world that you have to create as an author. It's not just the subject that you're talking about; it's everything that you build around that. So you have this sort of idyllic home in Brook End. And you also, of course, have, London and the conferences that Edward goes to and various other things. Where did you draw on that research and that inspiration for creating those scenes?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, Edward's attendance at conferences was based on factual things that happened, and I did do a lot of research into what was going on at the time. In terms of the world creation, I mean, I read a lot of books about books set in the 1920s, books written in the 1920s. Social history about that time. I do a lot of background research, so that all sort of feeds into the story. And I've got some characters in there who I think are quite amusing. Eleanor's best friend Sophie, who does play quite an important role in the book. She's quite a fun character.
I enjoyed Sophie very much.
Yeah, so yeah, there are some lighter parts to it.
And I think you need those because realistically, life has balance to it. And sometimes the balance gets a little skewed, but there are moments of levity and different things going on in people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm very curious about your comment that you made earlier about writing about periods of change. What draws you to these periods of change, and why this one in particular?
Yeah, I suppose I'm just really interested. I think in another life I'd like to do psychology or social psychology, because I'm just so interested in the way people behave towards each other, and as a group. I think we don't always question ourselves, and so when there are times of social change, it pushes people to behave maybe in ways which in calmer times that doesn't happen. So I was particularly interested in the 1920s, but partly for the reasons I explained. In the 1930s, I wrote about a story set in 1930s Leipzig, when there was a lot of change happening there, and just it pushes people, I think, to behave perhaps it pushes people to find inner strength that maybe they wouldn't have to in a normal time, if that makes sense. And yeah, I'm just really interested in the psychology of group and what makes somebody behave slightly out of the ordinary or differently to other people, which actually is more unusual than you think. So yeah, that's why I think I'm drawn to those times.
What do you think it was about this particular era, this particular moment in history, where a movement like eugenics that, again, I think we've so roundly rejected, in particular because of the horrors of what happened in Germany during World War II, but also, there was pushback during this era as well. But what allowed for that groundswell of support from some incredibly famous people?
Yeah, I think there's always complex reasons and a number of reasons behind it. But after the First World War, whilst America actually, had better economic success than we did in England. So we had a first couple of years where there was a big resurgence in the economy, and then it all went wrong and people were not very well off. We had a lot of unemployment, a lot of hardship. And I think at times when there's economic hardship, there's always quite a lot of social unrest, and people were fishing around trying to find something to blame. The Russian Revolution wasn't that long ago. There was a lot of rise all across Europe. There was a rise of fascism or communism. So the planned economy was very much thought to be the future. People thought democracy was under threat, coming to an end. There are certain resonances with some of what's going on today, I think. And the concept of Western culture, people really thought was endangered. And this idea that all this massive unemployed, unhappy working men on the streets, those kinds of people breeding quicker than the wealthier middle classes, was seen to be a threat. Their whole way of life was under threat. And there were predictions as well. I read somewhere that they were predicting by, I think it was 1960 or 1970, they thought the population of England would be only 4 million people, because people were, the wealthier people were practicing birth control, and that the population was just going to completely collapse. So there was a lot of fear. And I think these things, these slightly, what we think now as crazy ideas, come out of people's fear as a basis.
It feels like a very visceral reaction to a world that people don't feel completely in control of, or don't fully know what's going to happen, which really, in some ways, I can understand, because the First World War just devastated Britain's population, and nobody had seen anything like it before. So I imagine there was a lot of angst and a lot of concern over what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that continued into the 1930s. And part of the reason I set it around the economic crash was then, of course, America was in the same position. In particular, you know, they were very badly hit, and there was a worldwide slump, and that just fed into this whole, rhetoric.
It's an absolutely fascinating time period, and a fascinating topic. I would love to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the writing process. I'm really curious about what it is like writing a book that you do have a very personal connection to, and if that is a challenge in a different way from writing a book where maybe it's a little bit more at arm's length.
Yeah, it does definitely have obviously a personal resonance for me, but it also has a little bit of a therapeutic effect as well. I think it had to come out in some ways, and just airing these things I think is quite helpful. I just feel it's a story that needed to be told, and telling it is quite satisfying in that sense. But did I enjoy writing this book? Probably not as much as I've enjoyed writing the next one, which I don't have such a personal connection to. So, yeah.
Well, speaking about continuing to write, what is the writing process like for you? What does your writing day look like? Perhaps we'll start there.
Yeah, so I try to write during school hours when my youngest daughter's got two older kids as well, but they're at university and just beyond. Whereas my youngest is still at school, so I write during school hours, and I do. Yeah, it's a little bit of a mix and match, because obviously sometimes if I have a deadline coming up, I'll work in the evenings. I try to write most days, and if I'm not writing, I'm thinking about my book that I'm writing at the moment. Yes. I'm sure you can relate to that.
Feels very familiar.
With us. I don't know about you, but I'm not a plotter. I'm definitely...
that was going to be my next question.
I'm definitely not a plotter. I start with a theme, and a setting, and then I do some general research. And as I'm researching, the idea of the story kind of comes to me, and some vague ideas of characters, but I can't plan. So I have an idea for a beginning, vaguely what happens in the middle, and then the ending, and then I just write. And during that process of writing that first draft, I kind of get to know my characters, find some dead ends, find my way through the story. And then the next draft really is one that I do slower, because I know where I'm going then. So that's my perhaps slightly messy process.
I feel like, I used to apologize for my process and what it was, but then I just realized it is what it is, and everybody has a different one.
Exactly.
I'm interested that you said you start with a beginning and you know what the ending is. So you sort of have a point that you're working towards. Is that right?
Yes, I do. I do. I mean, obviously that may change through the process. Um, but yeah, I mean, the book I'm writing at the moment
Well,
is,
perhaps we can mention this book and
yeah,
then
I was,
talk about the writing process for it, because I feel
yeah,
like we've teased it so much we have to.
sorry. Yeah,
Not at
but
all.
like I had a character. So when I first started writing it, I had a character that was who was dead, and then I got halfway through this book and I realized that actually he needed to be alive. So I had to start it again. So that's just to show how messy my process is. Um, but yeah, so the next book I'm writing is set in the very early 1960s. Again, a time of social change, and it's really about society's expectation of women, what a woman and particularly a mother should be,
Mhm.
and also an older woman, what an older woman should be. It's kind of the story of a granddaughter and a grandmother, and it is about what happens if they don't conform to society's expectations.
That would be fascinating, because that again, as you said, is a period of incredible social change. And I know from my mother's story, who grew up in England and had some of her formative years in the 60s, there
Mm.
was such an incredible amount of change afoot. And as you say, the expectations of women really changes at that time as well, especially depending on class and country or part of the country you're in, and all of those things.
I should add that there is a thread that goes back to the 1940s, and it all kicks off with the granddaughter finding out something about herself, which had started then, and also how the position of women can go backwards as well as
Mhm.
forward.
When do you think we might see that book, or is it still being scheduled, as they say?
I don't know. I don't know. This one's taking me a bit longer than it probably should because I've had to keep changing things, but I'm hoping, yeah, I don't know, sometime towards the end of next year or the beginning of 2023
Okay,
possibly.
we'll keep an eye out for that. When you do run into those roadblocks when you're working, since you don't have an outline that you're working off of, what are you doing to sort of get through those difficult points in the story that you mentioned sometimes every author comes across?
Absolutely. I think it's really important, and of course I'm still learning as I'm going along, but I think it's really important to accept sometimes that it's better to throw stuff away and start afresh than to keep plowing on, not feeling like you're going in the right direction. I don't think anything is wasted. If I hadn't written all the words that I threw away, and let me tell you, I've thrown 70,000 words of this book away.
Terrifying. That's an entire book. But as you say, if it's not the right words for the book, then what are you going to do with them anyway?
Exactly, but they have absolutely helped me with the next version of this story. So I think it's important to remember that whatever you write, even if it doesn't end up in the final version, is not wasted because you're learning about the story, about the characters as you go along.
How do you feel about the editing process and being edited?
I actually love editing.
Oh, good, me too.
I said that really quietly, like it was a dirty secret. but yeah, no, I do enjoy the editing process because I feel that's where the magic happens. So you have a sort of rough stone, and you hone it really. So yeah, I enjoy it, and I know that when you first get your editing notes back, I'm sure you also feel this way. You look at them and you're like, oh my goodness, I've got to do all this extra work. But
Well, it's
then once you,
terrifying at first.
it is terrifying, and you usually have a sort of emotional reaction to it at the beginning. You're like, they said they loved it, they clearly don't.
Yes, I've also had that edit letter. That's so strange.
But actually then you just do it step by step by step, and your end result is always better. They are absolute professionals and they know how to make books better, and you just have to trust the process. So I'm getting better at managing that, but I know not to start straight away. I get my editing notes, I let them kind of absorb for a day or two before I get started. So
Well, that sounds very familiar. I typically get them, of course, by email these days and open them up, read them through, close my computer and think, well, those are dumb, and then walk away. And then it takes me about 12 to 24 hours, usually after I've had a good night's sleep and I'm rested. I'll come back and I'll think, actually, you know what? I see what they're trying to do there. I see what they're suggesting and how this thing connects with this thing. And it really is incredible. It's a bit of alchemy when you have a good editor who really, with just a couple of suggestions, can completely change what's not working in the book. And that's really where it becomes so valuable.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We're lucky to have you editors if you're watching.
Yes, we do love them. We do love them. We have another question from Wendy asking, do you find any resistance from your editors, and I'm going to throw in your agent as well, for focusing on this particular topic? And have you found any resistance from readers also?
I've not had any resistance from editors. I did have a few queries over having epilepsy as a voice in the book. But once we'd all sort of agreed how that was going to work, they totally accepted it. And it's always a collaboration. It's always, everything's up for discussion. And in terms of readers, I think, well, so far the reaction's been good to the book. I think some people have said it's a tough read, which parts of it definitely are.
I can understand that.
But, you know, I don't think you're going to get 100% of people reading any book and all 100% are going to love it. It's just the way things are. So, yeah, but on the whole, I think people have reacted well to it.
I think it's an important thing to remember that nobody loves everything universally, and the universe doesn't love everything. It doesn't love one thing universally. I had a friend the other day who told me she got her first one-starred review on Goodreads, and it's a bit of a rite of passage as an author to make somebody so angry that they one-star your book. And I think, you know, she was fine about it, and we were joking back and forth a little bit. But it's true. In some ways, what you want to do is elicit a strong reaction, and sometimes that strong reaction is, this book is not for me, if it's for somebody who's coming to it with a different set of expectations. But often I think that's actually a really positive thing. The thing that scares me the most is the people who sit there and say, it was okay, and can't really articulate what was so okay about it.
Yeah. I mean, do you know what, I'm sure you are too, in an authors group, and we sometimes share, you know, some of the reviews and have a bit of laugh over them, and it makes it much better. It's really important not to take them to heart, because actually reviews are really there for other readers. They're not there for the author.
Yes.
So if you kind of hold that in your head and think, well, actually, if somebody's taken the time to read the book and review it, that's a good thing.
Absolutely. I always think that reviews, good or bad, guide people to the books that they actually want to read, because as you say, they're really for readers. And so if anybody's watching and wonders if authors care about reviews or not, the biggest thing, the most helpful thing, is that they get the book in front of people who actually would like to read it and would like to buy it. And that's so valuable. That and word of mouth is really helpful too.
Definitely. The worst ones, though, are ones that, you know, they pick it up and then they say, well, this wasn't the thriller I was expecting it to be. And I'm like, well, it wasn't meant to be a thriller.
Yeah. I didn't like the cover. I'm really sorry. No control over the cover. So. Do you have any advice that you give to people who are just starting out with writing, and perhaps also just starting out with publishing, which those can be two different things?
Oh, definitely. I think, well, there's lots of advice, but one thing is, if you're writing and if you're just writing your first draft, don't compare it to books you read. You should read lots and lots, which is really helpful. But if you're trying to compare your very rough first draft with some amazing masterpiece that you've written, you're being totally unfair to yourself, because bear in mind that masterpiece has gone through tons of pairs of eyes, a million drafts, and it didn't start off like that. It started off
Correct.
as a rough first draft. That's one thing. And the second thing is, it feels like an impossible goal to be published when you just start out. But it isn't. You've just got to keep persisting, keep going, take advice, and just keep on going. Don't give up. That's my biggest piece of advice.
Would you mind sharing a bit of your publishing story of how you ended up with your first book?
Yeah, so I, like many authors, didn't know anybody in publishing. I totally was on the slush pile. I did, I wrote my first draft of my first book during the course of my master's in creative writing, which I did at St Mary's University. And I sent it out far too early, being all keen, like lots of us are. And of course,
Yes.
I had, 100% rejections. But I thought, I do believe in this story, but I know I can make it better. So I went to a literary consultancy, and I got an editorial report. And like we were talking earlier, I got it back and I thought, she said, oh, this is, a wonderful, wonderful story. I think there's really something in it. And then she gave me sort of 12 pages of what was wrong with it. And I definitely cried at that point, because I thought nothing about it is right. But then I set about, rolled up the sleeves, did a huge rewrite, which took me at least a year. In fact, I rewrote it a couple of times. And then I sent it out again. And I was quite disciplined about treating that part of it a bit like a job. So I went through all the agents. I did lots of research to find ones that I thought would be interested in the book. And I did then get 2 or 3 requests for the full manuscript. And I thought, yay, I've done it. This is amazing. And then I didn't hear anything else for weeks and weeks. I did chase up a couple of them. And one of them said to me, it's a close call. He really liked it, but it wasn't for him, but I should try. And then he gave me a list of about 5 other agents to try.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So I did another edit, and then I sent it out to, I was going to send it to all 5, but I was about to go on the school run. It was a Friday night. I sent it to 2, and then thought, oh, I'll do the other 3 on Monday. And then the agent, who is now my agent, she's amazing. She came back to me on Saturday morning and said, I'm loving it. And I just literally danced around the kitchen. That was my best moment ever. And then we had a chat on the Monday, and she agreed to represent me. And that was shortly before Christmas, and she asked me for a few edits, not too many, which I did over the sort of Christmas holidays. And then it went out on submission in the January. And I was really lucky that I got a book deal in the UK, in the US, and now it's published in 13 territories. So it's done really, really well, beyond my wildest dreams. I never ever imagined that. So it's totally possible. But yeah, you just got to keep going.
I love that story, because I think sometimes it's very tempting to see the final product and think, well, this must have sort of been mostly there, but it really, you're right. It's the process of, you need the right person at the right time with the right book. So you need to make those things happen, but also you do have to go through the editing stages. You do have to figure out, you're learning on the job, basically, in a way that I think people don't always tell you when you're first starting out.
And I think you have to edit it so much and go through it so many times that you are totally sick of it. And at that point, then you've probably done it enough. Until then, you probably haven't.
Which is a good lesson, because that's what publishing feels like. Also, I think by the time we finish our books, we probably are both very tired of reading the same thing over and over again, even though we're the ones who actually who wrote it. So
most definitely. But if I've got time, one little point of inspiration, which I actually posted on social media today, was about 4 years ago, when I was still unpublished and totally rejected by every agent. My husband and I had gone on holiday to the Amalfi Coast. It was our wedding anniversary, and we sat next to a couple we got chatting to. And she asked me what I did, and I told her I was a writer, which I felt really presumptuous about doing at the time. And she said, "Oh, my brother's an author." And her brother turned out to be Anthony Horowitz.
Oh,
And I was then totally mortified that I called myself a writer when her brother was world famous. And yeah, so anyway, roll on 4 years, and HarperCollins Canada posted today a picture of the new books out, Anthony Horowitz book next to my book on their post. And I was like, 4 years ago, I would never have dreamt that was possible. So there you go, a little bit of inspiration.
Inspiration and serendipity as well, I think.
Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I would love, while we still have a couple moments, to ask you a bit about what you're reading. Now, I know we were talking about some recent holidays, so I think both of us might be trying to grab some extra time to read while not working. But is there anything that you've been reading recently and really enjoying and recommending to people?
Yeah, so I am just in the middle of reading Claire Chambers' book called Learning to Swim, which is it's so beautiful. I discovered Claire Chambers where she wrote Small Pleasures.
I loved that book.
Which is absolutely amazing. So I thought, I'm going to read all of her books now. And this is equally good. It's about a cellist, and there's some sort of mystery between her and the older brother of someone who is her best friend, and she kind of gets adopted, absorbed into their family as a sort of teenager, and something happens. I haven't found out what yet, but it's beautifully written. So I highly recommend that as a great book to read.
I really, really enjoyed Small Pleasures, and that was a book that I saw absolutely everywhere in the UK. I think it was up for multiple awards, and has a very distinctive cover, and picked it up on a whim and just thought it was wonderful, really fantastic.
Yeah, I've also just read Jill Paul's new book, which is called The Collector's Daughter. And it's all about the daughter of Lord Carnarvon, who discovered Tutankhamun's tomb. And again, it's a dual timeline book set in the 70s and in the 1920s. And it's, again, beautifully written, a really fascinating story based on real people. So I recommend that one too.
Well, and you have excellent taste, because we talked to her about 4 weeks ago. So if you guys do, if you want to watch that interview back, it's just a little bit further back in the archives, but really wonderful book, and a fascinating set of characters. And again, a subject matter that I think is inherently really interesting, and a time period that's really interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for this. I want to make sure that we have a chance to remind people where they can find the book, first of all, and then also where they can find you online, so they can follow along with your career and get any updates from you.
Thank you. So I have a website, which is www.louisefeinauthor.com. I also am on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I'm even on TikTok, which is a new thing for me.
We'll have to chat behind the scenes.
Yeah. On all those things, I'm Louise Fein Author, or Fein Louise on Twitter. I think I'm quite easy to find. And the book is available in all good bookshops. That's the American cover. I haven't brought the UK cover with me, but it's also available in the UK with a different cover, same title. So yeah, do try and support your independent bookshop if possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much. This has been wonderful, and I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with us. It's just been fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you guys for watching, and we'll be back next week.